BlackBerry used to be the biggest mobile phone manufacturer in the United States, but now they're absolutely nowhere to be seen. So what happened to them? Well, today we're going to be going over their entire history and seeing what went wrong. So we're going to go back to the start. Research in Motion Limited were founded in March 1984 by Mike Lazaridis and Douglas Fragan, two friends who were engineering students. In the early years of Research in Motion, they mostly dealt with manufacturing contracts and were with multiple companies such as General Motors and Rogers. They generally made products such as radio modems and signs and other things like that. But then in 1997, using the connections they made, they released the 950 pager, a two-way interactive pager which went on to big success. The success of this pager in the business world meant that Research in Motion continued to make these devices, and in 1999, Research in Motion created BlackBerry. The first device to carry the BlackBerry name was the BlackBerry 850, and this was an email pager, meaning you could email on the go. So it has a somewhat resemblance to the BlackBerries you probably all know, and the actual name BlackBerry was named after the keys, as they look supposedly like the droplets of Blackberries. So these BlackBerry devices were doing incredibly well in the business landscape. They brought about functionality which wasn't really experienced before, as I said, email capability on the go, as well as messaging. It was big for the time. And with this newfound success, in 2002, BlackBerry released their first device with mobile phone capability, and this was the BlackBerry 5810. The BlackBerry 5810 wasn't actually received as well as other BlackBerry products, with it not having a microphone or speaker, and obviously for a phone, well, that's pretty necessary, so you actually had to plug in a headset if you wanted to make calls. This didn't deter BlackBerry from continuing to making mobile phone devices. Now, one of the reasons they were so successful in these early days was due to the BlackBerry operating system, which was launched with the first BlackBerry in 1999, and it was incredibly functional for the time and continued to grow in functionality with every device. So BlackBerry grew massively in its first few years. However, there was room for expansion, as I said before, these devices were targeted at businesses, and most of their adverts were focused towards businesses, being in business magazines, and as such, most of their clients were businesses. So this obviously meant that they sold in bulk. However, they knew the consumer market was where the real cash is. And so it wasn't long before BlackBerry entered with the BlackBerry Pearl 8100. It was their first mobile device with a camera and media player, and this was obviously huge for the time. Carrying this successful BlackBerry name, the BlackBerry Pearl 8100 was hugely successful, which led to the release of the Curve 8300 series and the Bold 9000, both of which were commercial successes thanks in part to their extensive carrier partnerships. BlackBerry grew a good relation with Verizon, and this continued throughout their lifespan. And at this point now, BlackBerry, they were living the life. They had become global, and they were selling all across the world and had become one of the most popular phone brands in the world. But then what you might think would be the turning point, in 2007 along came the iPhone.
And we are calling it iPhone. Today Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
Now you might be thinking this was the end of BlackBerry. However, if anything, they continue to grow at unprecedented levels. However, the iPhone was doing okay, and BlackBerry did see this, and they did respond as you expect them to. And the massive feature of the iPhone was, of course, the touchscreen, which was not on any BlackBerry products until 2008, where they introduced the BlackBerry Storm, and it actually sold quite well. And this was because the iPhone was originally locked to one mobile provider in countries. For example, the US, it was locked to AT&T. So if you were loyal to Verizon, well, you wouldn't buy an iPhone, and if you wanted a touchscreen device, the BlackBerry Storm was there. And obviously, carrying the BlackBerry name, a lot of people assumed it was going to be a good device. But this was probably the start of BlackBerry's problems. It was not a good device. It was received poorly because, well, iOS, which was obviously the iPhone's operating system, was built entirely around the touchscreen. Whilst the Storm, it was basically they needed to have something with the touchscreen to make it look like they were, going with the times. And BlackBerry's operating system was not designed for touchscreen, which meant that having a touchscreen in a device which is essentially built for a keyboard, it was really poor. It was a really poor user experience. Along with that, the touchscreen itself was poor. It was more of a capacitive touchscreen. It really damaged BlackBerry because it meant that they didn't actually make that many more touchscreen devices from then on. At around the same time, of course, Android was released as well. But like the iPhone, Android didn't actually get off to an incredibly good start. And so BlackBerry was still the market leader, which meant that Apple and Android were in a position of chasing, which meant they obviously had to continue to improve their products, whilst BlackBerry, in a position of comfort, well, they stagnated. And that meant in 2010, after 2 years of extensive marketing and continuing to push their products to new boundaries such as the iPhone 4, the figures finally started to show. The figures showed that quarterly from 2010 onwards, iPhones sold more than BlackBerries. And looking at it from an Android perspective, in January 2010, barely 3 million, which is 7.1% of the 42.7 million smartphones in the United States were running Android. So 3 million of 42 million, compared to 18 million BlackBerry devices. So despite having a massive head start, within a year, Android passed the install base of BlackBerry in the United States. By February 2016, only 1.59 million of the 198 million smartphone users in the United States were running a BlackBerry, compared to 104 million running Android. But why did it take this long for the effects to happen? Well, as we said before with the iPhones, they were locked to a provider, whilst early Android models were honestly clunky. And the operating system wasn't built for one device, which meant that the user experience varied massively depending on the device. So for example, the cheaper Android models, well, they really struggled to run Android. And on the other end, the operating system didn't take full advantage of the hardware of the higher end expensive Androids. So with BlackBerry failing to evolve and Apple and Android sorting themselves out, BlackBerry's market share in the United States from 2011 onwards fell dramatically. However, globally, they were actually selling more. But analysts were starting to get worried about the company. They had a co-CEO management structure, and the company lost Larry Connolly, which was a huge blow for the company, who had served as the COO of engineering and manufacturing from 2001 to 2009, and he retired. And it was from then that BlackBerry internally began to lose their way, not only externally, but internally. Connolly was key to the company's platform manufacturing strategy, and he was actually a pragmatic taskmaster who ensured deadlines were met. And Connolly had the clout within the company to push back if Lazaridis had unrealistic expectations. And once this went, it was from then on that we see BlackBerry's attempts to fight back. So in March 2011, Research in Motion announced that all new powerful BlackBerries, which compete with the iPhone and Androids, would launch in 2012. This was nearly a year away, and this reveal hurt sales in the meantime, because who would want to buy a new BlackBerry when they know that this all-new powerful one's going to be coming out pretty soon? As well as that, after the success of Apple's iPad in 2010, BlackBerry decided to launch their own tablet, the BlackBerry Playbook. However, it was a commercial flop, with BlackBerry's operating system not being up to standard and reviewers saying it was rushed to market. And all this led to, in 2011, the company laid off 2,000 employees. And on March 29, 2012, the company reported its first net loss in years. Now back to those all-new BlackBerries that were supposed to compete with iPhone and Androids. Well, as I said, they were supposed to launch in 2012, which was already a year away from when they announced this. Well, guess what? They were delayed until 2013. Now, these all-new BlackBerries were powered by BlackBerry X, which was supposed to be the competitor to iOS and Android OS. It was supposed to take their phones into the modern world and be more like Android. And it launched along with two phones, the BlackBerry Z10 and the Q10. But despite being a step up from the operating before, it was still nowhere near the level of Android or iOS, with, for example, the App Store having far less apps. Think, for example, of the Fire phone and how that failed. Well, this was a similar circumstance. BlackBerry didn't give up. They continued to try to fight. And in May 2014, BlackBerry released the Z10 in Indonesia, which was supposed to be a budget phone to compete with, budget Androids. The problem was it was still twice the price of Androids. And so guess what? It didn't sell well. And then in September 2015, they looked like they were taking a step forward as they announced the BlackBerry Priv, a BlackBerry of Android. But once again, it didn't sell well. Now, this all led to, in 2016, BlackBerry announcing that they would no longer be manufacturing their own mobile phones. This wasn't actually the end of BlackBerry phones, because BlackBerry from then on licensed out their name, and there were a few devices with the BlackBerry name from 2016 onwards. However, none of these succeeded. And in 2020, they licensed to a new company. However, this new company never released a device and ultimately shut down in 2022. BlackBerry nowadays focus on cybersecurity. They don't make physical products, and they are surviving. They're doing okay. Obviously, nothing compared to the glory days of 2002 to about 2011 onwards. As for the future, though, with the license running out, I don't think we're ever going to see a new BlackBerry phone. So now we're going to move on to why they succeeded in the first place and why they ultimately failed. So let's start off with why they succeeded. So first of all, they stuck to their roots. Obviously, early on, they were a business company, and they made devices for businesses, and they did make that step into the consumer market. But when making that step to the consumer market, they still were great phones for businesses, and they continued to have that market base. Email and texting functionality was put first, and the keyboard was great. The full keyboard was instrumental to their success in the early days, with many finding it easier to use than the touchscreen, especially with the sizes of touchscreens from about 2007 to 2011. They weren't that big, which meant that having a full-size keyboard was actually quicker to type on. As well as that, the security of their devices was something that was known for. Marketing as well was a big success for them. Many celebrities back in the day were seen with BlackBerries, and it was seen as cool to have a BlackBerry. You know, there was Kim Kardashian with a BlackBerry, or Barack Obama, and it's like there was that sense of, if it's good enough for them, if it's good enough for these multi-millionaire celebrities, well, it's good enough for me, isn't it? There was also BlackBerry Messenger, which was big at the time, and it came at a time which smartphones were limited. They were really limited in the early 2000s, and having this extra functionality meant, for most, they were the best smartphone available at the time. And this was obviously around 2004 to 2007 until the iPhone came along. But in that time, they managed to grow a massive install base who were loyal to them. And this meant that up until, 2011, 2012, there were still many people who were loyal to BlackBerry. But now let's move on to why they failed. And I think the biggest one is the failure to adapt to the times. BlackBerry's functionality in terms of messaging devices, I don't think has ever been questioned. But with the launch of the iPhone, phones became more than just messaging devices. And whilst phones before it were technically multimedia devices, the extra screen size that came with the iPhone genuinely turned it into a multimedia device. You could genuinely watch high quality movies. You could play high quality games similar to an actual portable games console. And this was not possible on the BlackBerry, even though yes, it did have the capability to watch videos on. What would you rather watch a film on? A landscape iPhone or a BlackBerry? For me though, their biggest failure was not moving to Android. BlackBerry had the biggest market share in the United States at the time Android was introduced. And had BlackBerry been one of the first to move over to Android, whilst yes, obviously still selling their popular devices like the Curve with the keyboard at the time, if they had moved over to Android early on and cemented themselves as one of the big Android brands, they would have been the biggest Android brand. And you look at Android today, well, the biggest Android company you would say is Samsung. BlackBerry had far more customers than Samsung at the time in terms of mobile phones, and many of these would have stayed loyal to BlackBerry. So BlackBerry genuinely could have been the Samsung of today, and they should have been. I know it's easy to say with hindsight, but I do think that's their biggest failure. Obviously, you might say, well, they did move to Android, but by the time they did, their market share had gone, the customers weren't loyal to them, and the customers that were loyal to them, well, they were only in it for the keyboard, basically, and they had nothing special to stand out. And at that time, Samsung, HTC, and the like, they'd already had, if you were buying an Android, you're going to go to them. And so there we go. That is the sad story of BlackBerry and how they failed. What do you think was the biggest part in their decline? Let me know in the comments down below. And for more tech news, be sure to subscribe.